Through the iron bars of the condemned cell, your father's eyes meet yours one final time. "My son," he whispers, "tomorrow you will choose between the empire and your heart. Choose the empire." But as you grip the executioner's sword that has been passed down through your family for generations, you wonder if some traditions demand too high a price, even from those sworn to serve without question. Welcome to another journey through the shadows of history, where we explore the moment when duty and love collide with devastating consequences. Close your eyes, settle back, and let me take you to 1566 Istanbul, where a young man faces the most impossible choice any son could imagine. Mehmet had always known this day might come. Not this exact day, not this exact circumstance, but the possibility had lurked in the shadows of his family's profession like a dark inheritance passed down alongside the ceremonial blade. The executioner's tower stood apart from the main palace complex, its austere stone walls a necessary reminder of justice's final form. For 3 generations, the men of his family had served as the Sultan's executioners, wielding death with precision and mercy in service to the empire's law. His grandfather, Hassan the Just, had been renowned for his skill and discretion. A single stroke, they said, so clean and swift that condemned men felt no pain, only the sudden lightness of a soul departing flesh. His father, Ali ibn Hassan, had inherited both the position and the reputation, serving Sultan Suleiman with unwavering loyalty through 2 decades of imperial justice. Now, at 19, Mehmet had completed his apprenticeship under his father's tutelage. He knew the weight of the blade, the angle of the stroke, the prayers that must be whispered before and after. He had learned to see past the humanity of the condemned to the necessity of the law. To deliver death as a craftsman delivers any work, with skill, speed, and professional detachment. But tonight, as he sat in the chamber beneath the execution platform, all of that training felt meaningless. Tomorrow he would either become a master executioner by killing his own father, or break a sacred trust that had bound his family to the Ottoman throne for 60 years. The case against Ali ibn Hassan had unfolded with the cold precision of a legal mechanism designed to crush resistance. 3 months earlier, whispers had begun circulating about the executioner's unusual visits to certain quarters of the city, meetings that seemed to have nothing to do with his official duties. The investigation, led by the Grand Vizier's secret agents, revealed a web of correspondence between Ali and known dissidents, former officials who had been displaced by recent administrative reforms, military commanders who questioned the empire's current direction, religious scholars who believed the Sultan had strayed from orthodox interpretation of Islamic law. At first, the evidence seemed circumstantial. A veteran executioner might reasonably maintain contacts throughout the city. His position required a certain awareness of political currents and social tensions. But then the investigators discovered the letters, carefully coded messages that detailed plans for coordinated resistance to imperial policy. The final piece of evidence proved most damning: a detailed map of the palace complex in Ali's handwriting, showing guard rotations, security procedures, and potential points of access. When confronted with this evidence during his trial, Ali had remained silent, neither confirming nor denying the charges. The court proceedings had been swift and thorough. 3 judges, each renowned for their fairness and legal scholarship, examined every piece of evidence with meticulous care. Character witnesses testified to Ali's years of faithful service, but the documentary proof of his treasonous communications proved overwhelming. When the sentence was pronounced, death by beheading, a strange silence had fallen over the courtroom. Everyone present understood the terrible irony. The empire's chief executioner would himself face execution, and custom demanded that his son and successor carry out the sentence. Ottoman legal tradition was precise on this matter. When a man in service to the Sultan committed treason, his family faced a choice: complete disgrace and exile, or restoration of honor through participation in justice. For families in certain professions, executioners, judges, military commanders, this participation took a specific form. The condemned man's eldest son must personally carry out the execution, demonstrating that loyalty to the empire transcended even the bonds of blood. This practice served multiple purposes. It prevented the development of family-based opposition to imperial authority, it ensured that justice was seen to be truly impartial, and it tested the absolute commitment of those who served in positions of ultimate trust. Mehmet had known this law since childhood, had even understood its grim logic, but understanding and experiencing proved to be vastly different things. The theoretical possibility of executing a family member seemed remote and abstract when discussed as legal principle. The immediate reality felt like a dagger thrust through his heart. The palace imam who delivered the formal notification of his duty had spoken with gentle authority. "Young Mehmet, Allah tests those he loves most severely. Your father's crime has placed a burden upon you that no son should bear. But the law is clear, and mercy lies in swift completion of what justice demands." 3 days had passed since that notification. 3 days to prepare his mind, to pray for strength, to somehow reconcile the irreconcilable. In less than 12 hours, he would walk onto the execution platform carrying the sword that had served his family for 3 generations, and use it to end the life of the man who had taught him to wield it. The conversation through the cell bars had been their first private moment since Ali's arrest. Palace protocol kept father and son separated to prevent any possibility of escape plans or emotional manipulation, but tradition allowed one final meeting between the condemned and his executioner. Ali looked older than his 45 years, the strain of imprisonment and impending death having carved new lines around his eyes, but his voice remained steady, carrying the same quiet authority that had guided Mehmet through years of difficult training. "You are troubled, my son. I can see it in your face." Mehmet gripped the iron bars until his knuckles whitened. "How can I not be troubled? They ask me to. They ask you to serve the empire that has given our family honor for 3 generations," Ali interrupted gently. "They ask you to uphold the law that makes order possible, even when that law demands sacrifice from those who serve it. But you are my father. You taught me everything I know about justice, about mercy, about the proper way to serve Allah and the Sultan. How can justice demand that you complete my punishment?" Ali's eyes held a strange mixture of sadness and pride. Because justice that stops short of justice is not justice at all. Because the law that bends for personal feeling will break for personal interest. Because the empire depends on men who will choose duty over desire, even when the cost seems unbearable. Through the bars, Ali reached out to touch his son's hand. "I have failed in my duty, Mehmet. The evidence against me is true. I allowed my personal judgment to overcome my professional obligation. I believed I knew better than the Sultan what the empire needed, and that pride led me to commit the greatest sin a servant can commit: betrayal of trust." The admission struck Mehmet like a physical blow. Until this moment, he had clung to the possibility that his father was innocent, that some terrible mistake or conspiracy had led to his condemnation. Learning that the charges were true somehow made the situation both more bearable and more devastating. Why? The question escaped as barely a whisper. Why would you risk everything, your position, your honor, your life, for a cause that seems hopeless? Ali was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the stone walls of his cell. "Because I believed the empire was heading toward catastrophe, and I thought I could help guide it away from destruction. Because I saw policies that seemed to weaken our foundations and alliances that seemed to compromise our principles. He paused, then continued with evident regret. But I was wrong to act on those beliefs through conspiracy and betrayal. A servant's duty is to advise when asked, to obey when commanded, and to accept when overruled. I forgot that wisdom and replaced it with arrogance. The explanation provided context, but no comfort. Mehmet could even understand his father's motivations: the desire to serve the empire's best interests, the frustration with policies that seemed misguided, the gradual slide from concern to conspiracy. But understanding made the betrayal more painful, not less. "What am I supposed to do?" Mehmet asked, his voice breaking slightly. "How can I carry out an execution when every fiber of my being rebels against it?" "How can I honor you by killing you?" Ali's grip on his son's hand tightened. "By remembering that honor lies in service, not in personal comfort. By understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love is to set aside love for a higher purpose. By completing the duty that will allow our family name to continue in honor rather than end in disgrace." Alone in his quarters, Mehmet faced the longest night of his life. The executioner's sword lay on the table before him, its blade gleaming in the candlelight with the careful maintenance that his father had taught him. Every detail of the weapon carried memories: the slight curve near the point that his grandfather had shaped, the worn leather grip that bore the impressions of 3 generations of hands, the inscription in Arabic that asked Allah's blessing on those who served justice. Sleep proved impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face, not the worn, imprisoned face from tonight's conversation, but the younger face from childhood memories. Ali teaching him to read Quranic verses, explaining the principles of Islamic law, demonstrating the proper stance for sword work, sharing stories of their family's service to the empire. The irony was profound. Everything his father had taught him about duty, honor, and service now demanded that he act against every natural instinct. The lessons in professional detachment, in seeing beyond personal feelings to legal necessity, in serving the empire's needs above his own desires, all of these now pointed toward a single, impossible act. He tried to pray, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. How could he ask Allah for strength to kill his father? How could he seek divine blessing for an act that violated every understanding of filial duty and natural affection? Yet how could he refuse to serve the justice that his faith demanded and his position required? The other path lay open before him. He could refuse, could break the chain of family service, could choose personal loyalty over imperial duty. But that choice would destroy not just his own future, but the honor of 3 generations. His grandfather's memory would be tainted, his father's service forgotten, their family name erased from the rolls of the empire's faithful servants. As gray light began to filter through the narrow window of his chamber, Mehmet knew that delay would solve nothing. The execution was scheduled for the 2nd hour after sunrise, allowing time for the formal rituals but preventing the kind of prolonged spectacle that could become politically dangerous. He performed his morning prayers with unusual intensity, seeking clarity, if not comfort. The familiar words provided a framework for his chaotic thoughts, reminding him of duties that transcended immediate emotion and principles that outlasted individual circumstances. The ceremonial preparation began with the ritual cleansing of the sword. 3 times he washed the blade with blessed water. 3 times he dried it with consecrated cloth. 3 times he tested its edge against a single hair. The weapon must be perfect, sharp enough to ensure instant death, balanced enough to strike true, clean enough to honor the condemned. Dressing in the executioner's ceremonial robes felt like donning a costume for a play in which he was both actor and audience. The black silk outer robe, the white linen undergarment, the leather gloves that would prevent the sword from slipping in his grasp. Each piece of clothing carried the weight of tradition and the promise of irreversible action. As he secured the executioner's mask over his face, Mehmet felt the last of his personal identity disappear behind the role he was about to fulfill. The mask served both practical and symbolic purposes. It protected the executioner from being recognized in daily life, and it represented the impersonal nature of justice itself. The execution platform had been erected in the central courtyard of the palace complex, where an assembly of officials, guards, and specially invited witnesses could observe justice being carried out. The crowd was smaller than usual. Palace administrators had been careful to limit attendance to those whose presence was necessary for legal or ceremonial reasons. As Mehmet climbed the wooden steps to the platform, he could feel hundreds of eyes upon him. Some watched with professional interest, evaluating his technique and demeanor. Others observed with the morbid curiosity that public executions invariably attracted. A few seemed genuinely sympathetic to his terrible predicament. The platform itself was starkly simple, a raised wooden surface perhaps 10 feet square with a single block of dark wood positioned at its center. The block had been carved from a single piece of oak and shaped to provide the proper angle for a clean execution. Dark stains on its surface testified to years of use. Ali was brought onto the platform by 2 guards, his hands bound behind his back, but his bearing still dignified despite the circumstances. He had been allowed to dress in clean white robes appropriate for meeting his creator, and his face showed no sign of fear or regret. Father and son stood facing each other for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Through the executioner's mask, Mehmet looked into eyes that held love, pride, and profound sadness. Ali gave the slightest nod, an acknowledgement, a blessing, a final gesture of approval for the son who would take his life. Protocol required that the condemned be given opportunity for final words before the sentence was carried out. Ali stepped forward slightly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. I stand before Allah and His representatives on earth having committed crimes against the empire that nurtured and protected me. I do not ask for mercy, for my actions were deliberate and my guilt is clear. I ask only that my family's service to the throne be remembered alongside my betrayal, and that my son be judged by his own actions rather than by mine. He paused, then continued with evident emotion. To my son, who must now complete what justice demands, I say this. You are the finest man I have ever known, and carrying out this sentence will not diminish that truth. Serve with honor, serve with wisdom, and remember that sometimes the greatest love requires the greatest sacrifice. The Imam stepped forward to offer final prayers, reciting verses about divine mercy and the importance of accepting Allah's will in all circumstances. The words provided a framework of meaning for what was about to occur, transforming a moment of personal agony into an act of religious and civic duty. As the prayers concluded, Ali walked to the execution block and knelt without assistance. His composure never wavered, even as he positioned his neck against the worn wood and waited for the blow that would end his life. Mehmet raised the sword, feeling its familiar weight distributed along his arms and shoulders. 3 years of training had prepared his body for this motion, but no amount of training could have prepared his heart for its current target. Time seemed to slow as Mehmet brought the sword to its highest point. Every detail of the moment burned itself into his memory with painful clarity. The morning light gleaming off the blade, the absolute silence of the watching crowd, the sight of his father's exposed neck positioned precisely for the stroke. In that suspended instant, 3 generations of family tradition converged into a single action. His grandfather's ghost seemed to guide the weapon's path. His father's teachings controlled its speed and angle, and his own training ensured its accuracy. The sword fell with the inevitability of justice itself. The execution was perfect, a single, clean stroke that severed the neck completely without requiring a second blow. Death was instantaneous, as mercy demanded and professional pride required. Ali ibn Hassan died as he had lived, with dignity, honor, and faith in the empire he had served despite his final betrayal. The crowd remained silent for several moments after the deed was done. Even those who had witnessed many executions seemed affected by the terrible irony of this particular death. When the imam finally stepped forward to perform the final rites, his voice carried unusual emotion as he commended Ali's soul to divine mercy. Mehmet stood motionless beside the block, the bloodied sword still in his hands, his body functioning on trained reflex while his mind struggled to process what he had just accomplished. He had become a master executioner in the most complete and terrible sense possible. He had executed perfect justice upon the person he loved most in the world. The formal ceremonies that followed the execution passed in a blur of ritual and procedure. Mehmet found himself moving through the required actions, cleaning the sword, accepting condolences from court officials, receiving formal confirmation of his appointment as the new imperial executioner, without fully comprehending their significance. The palace imam offered words of comfort that seemed to come from a great distance. You have honored your father, your family, and your empire by placing duty above personal desire. Allah recognizes the sacrifice you have made and will reward your faithfulness in His own time. Other officials expressed similar sentiments, praising his professionalism and dedication to imperial service. But their words felt hollow against the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, performed an act that would define the remainder of his life regardless of any future achievements or honors. As the crowd dispersed and the platform was dismantled, Mehmet was left alone with the weight of his new position and the memory of what had brought him to it. The sword that had ended his father's life would now serve as the primary tool of his profession, carrying out future sentences with the same precision and mercy he had just demonstrated. But he knew that no future execution would ever carry the same personal cost. He had proven his absolute loyalty to the empire in the most dramatic way possible, and that proof would shield him from suspicion for the remainder of his career. The terrible irony was that his father's betrayal had ultimately secured his son's position more completely than a lifetime of faithful service might have achieved. In the days that followed, Mehmet discovered that his deed had achieved exactly what Ottoman law intended. His family's honor was not merely preserved but enhanced by his demonstration of loyalty beyond personal feeling. Court officials spoke of him with new respect, and his position became more secure than it had ever been under his father's tenure. Yet the honor felt like chains around his soul. Every expression of praise reminded him of the price he had paid for imperial favor. Every execution he performed carried echoes of that first terrible stroke. The sword that had once felt like a tool of justice now seemed to whisper accusations with every use. Sleep brought no relief, for his dreams were haunted by the memory of his father's final moments. Sometimes he relived the execution exactly as it had occurred. Other times his unconscious mind created alternative scenarios where he refused to strike, where his father escaped, where some miraculous intervention saved them both from their impossible situation. During waking hours, he threw himself into his duties with unprecedented intensity. If he was to bear the burden of what he had done, at least he could ensure that it served the empire's needs as perfectly as possible. Every execution was carried out with meticulous care, every sentence delivered with the precision his father had taught him to value. Months passed, then a year, then two. Mehmet's reputation as an executioner grew to match and then exceed his father's legacy. His technical skill was unquestioned, his professionalism complete, his loyalty to the empire absolute. He became the standard by which other imperial servants measured dedication to duty. But success brought no peace. The memory of his father's execution remained as vivid as the day it occurred. a permanent wound that showed no signs of healing. He had learned to function around the pain, to perform his duties despite the emotional burden, but he had never learned to truly accept what he had done. Sometimes he wondered if his father had foreseen this outcome, if Ali had deliberately chosen betrayal knowing that it would ultimately strengthen his son's position within the imperial hierarchy. The possibility that his father's treason had been a form of sacrifice rather than simple betrayal added new layers of complexity to his grief and guilt. Religious counselors assured him that he had acted righteously, that divine approval rested upon those who chose duty over personal comfort. Legal scholars praised his adherence to Ottoman law and tradition. Military commanders cited his example when training subordinates about the absolute nature of loyalty to the Sultan. Yet none of these assurances touched the fundamental ache in his heart. He had killed his father to preserve honor, and that honor now felt like a magnificent tomb, beautiful to behold, but cold and empty within. As the years accumulated, Mehmet began to understand his father's perspective more clearly. The weight of serving imperial justice day after day, year after year, eventually ground down even the strongest sense of personal identity. The executioner became less a person than a function, less an individual than an instrument of state policy. This gradual erosion of self made the work bearable, but at a tremendous cost. To survive in such a position, one had to become partially deaf to the cries of conscience, partially blind to the humanity of the condemned, partially numb to the moral complexity of any individual case. The alternative was madness or abandonment of duty. He began to suspect that his father's betrayal had grown from this same erosion, that years of serving as an instrument of death had eventually led Ali to question whether the empire he served was worth the sacrifice it demanded. The conspiracy might have been less about political opposition than about reclaiming some measure of human agency in a role that seemed to deny humanity itself. This understanding brought neither forgiveness nor peace, but it did provide context for the impossible choice his father had created. Ali had faced his own moment of decision between empire and conscience, and he had chosen conscience. That choice had then forced his son to choose empire over family, completing a cycle that demonstrated the ultimate supremacy of imperial law over personal desire. In his 20th year as imperial executioner, Mehmet trained his own son in the traditions and techniques of their profession, teaching the young man to handle the sword, to maintain proper stance, to deliver death with mercy and precision brought back memories of his own training under his father's patient guidance. When his son asked about his grandfather, Mehmet found himself repeating many of the same lessons Ali had taught him about duty, honor, and service to the empire. But he also added warnings about the dangers of allowing personal judgment to override professional obligation, about the importance of remembering that servants advise but rulers decide. The boy listened with the same mixture of eagerness and apprehension that Mehmet remembered from his own youth, unaware that his family's service had been purchased with the most terrible price imaginable. That innocence was precious and necessary. The burden of memory was Mehmet's alone to bear. As he watched his son practice sword forms in the courtyard below their quarters, Mehmet reflected on the strange mathematics of honor and sacrifice. His father's betrayal had led to his own advancement. His terrible duty had secured his family's future. His personal agony had become the foundation of professional success. Whether that equation balanced or not remained beyond his ability to calculate. He had chosen empire over heart, as his father had advised, and the empire had rewarded that choice with position, respect, and security. But the cost continued to compound with interest that would apparently never stop accumulating. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll consider the weight carried by those who serve principles larger than themselves. Mehmet's story reminds us that honor and duty sometimes demand prices that seem too high for mortal souls to pay. Yet, throughout history, individuals have found the strength to pay them anyway. The executioner who killed his father to preserve imperial law discovered that loyalty tested to such extremes changes both the loyal and the principles they serve. His absolute devotion to duty preserved his family's honor but at the cost of his personal peace, secured his professional future but haunted his private moments. His choice reflects the eternal tension between love and law, between personal bonds and public obligations, between the demands of the heart and the requirements of honor. There are no easy answers to such dilemmas, no formulas for weighing one sacred duty against another when they come into irreconcilable conflict. Sleep well, knowing that throughout history, individuals have faced impossible choices with courage and determination, accepting burdens that lesser souls could not bear in service to principles they believed transcended their personal comfort. In their sacrifice, we find both inspiration and humility. Inspiration in their strength, humility in our recognition that we cannot judge choices we have never been forced to make. Honor preserved through sacrifice remains honor, even when the sacrifice breaks the heart that offers it.